please challenge us, right, with your questions, with your disagreements, and we will answer it.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Uh, Thanks a lot, Bryan. So I think that was really interesting. Guys, do you have anything to say? Any comments? Anything to ask? Any questions?
It's very challenging, criticisms. We may not get it all right. We'll try our best to answer it.
Yeah, Daniel, I think, Daniel, you can unmute your mic and ask. No worries.
Hi Brian, hi Donovan. So I have let's just get the elephant out of the room, right? So if people are allowed to be irrational, right, would it somehow lead to some kind of a suboptimal social outcome? And the most common attack on let's say fair economics, right, is that it will eventually lead to some kind of income inequality. So without accounting for government intervention, how would this problem be solved?
Right. Okay. So income inequality is a very big topic. Usually, we deal with it in a separate session. We do 2 hours, but we're happy to answer that. So I think first and foremost, right, we need to understand there's a fundamental difference between poverty and inequality. Okay. So poverty means that you don't have enough. You don't have enough money. You don't have enough resources to meet your basic needs. But inequality is a very different thing. Inequality just means that I don't have as much as someone else. Jeff Bezos have 5 bungalows, he has 5 Ferraris, I have nothing, right? So it's a relative measure. Poverty is an absolute measure, right? So I like to always put this, because I think many people, right, we conflate inequality with poverty. Generally, if you look at the empirical, historical record of capitalism of markets, it is always very good in creating wealth, in reducing poverty, in increasing the standard of living for people, right? But yes, it is true that there is inequality. Some will have more than others. But just because some has more than others does not mean that the people at the lower classes are poor, you see. So what we are trying to say is that even though markets, right, may involve levels of inequality, right, because of the great wealth that's created historically. I mean, we have like lots of data and whatever, but we can't show it here, right? Even if you are the bottom 10%, you are much better off in a market society than you would be in a society with less economic freedom, right? So we are saying that poverty is an important concern. With markets, with economic freedom, right? There will be much less poverty in the world. There'll be much less poverty, right? The question is that do you want a society whereby, right, there's inequality, right? But everyone is still generally well off, or would you want a society? Yes, you have equality, but because you put in place policies of redistribution, wealth taxes, minimum wage, and all these things, policies to increase equality will end up slowing economic growth, right? And end up harming poverty reduction. So there is a trade-off, right? So which is why, like counterintuitively speaking, right? If you want to have less poor people, right, we need to have some kind of inequality. We need to embrace inequality, actually. It's not always a bad, right? So that's just one response, but I think Donovan has more and we can chat more.
No, I think you summarized it quite well. I guess maybe I'll just add on that like um inequality is I don't want to it's a good question and I don't want to dismiss it. I think inequality has some importance, right? But it shouldn't be the primary goal. At least I don't think so. The primary goal is whether the least well off in society are being held up, are being pushed up. Are their standards of living rising? And if you use that benchmark, I would argue that yes, if you look at any society in the world, it is always the countries with the rich developed countries who have very high level of income inequality, but the least well off in those societies are so much better off than people who come from the developing nations, right? Just imagine like being born in Singapore versus being born in say somewhere like Malaysia or Indonesia. Would you rather be a poor person in Singapore or in those countries? I think most of us would say Singapore.
So I think, as I said, we are not trying to play down, the fact that there are people who live well off than us, right?
Mm.
The question for us is how can we create the conditions for everyone, right, to be economically empowered, to have a better life. And we believe that this comes from free markets. We believe that this comes from an environment that rewards wealth creation, that rewards job creation. So people have good jobs and better jobs, right?
Mm.
And actually, in our book, right, we have a chapter exploring the data behind this, right? Donovan and I, we actually went to look at the household income levels of people in Singapore, and we compare it with neighboring countries, and we specifically tier it according to the income levels. Top 10%, the next 10%, and we look at actually the bottom 10%, right? They have actually gotten rich faster than the rich got rich over the last 10 years, right? And this is actually from Singapore's own data. We just got it from the Singapore government's official statistics and compared it with the other countries, right? And I guess just one last point to this very good question is that inequality, of course, there are different types of inequality, okay? Sometimes, I think Donovan will agree with me, sometimes inequality really is a bad thing, okay? But it depends on how the inequality was formed. We can't just have a snapshot view and say there's inequality. The question is a dynamic view. How did the inequality arise? Right? Inequality can sometimes arise from special privileges. When big corporations and politically well-connected people, right, they gain subsidies, bailouts, special interests, special privileges because you're friends of Donald Trump, and because of that, your income is 5 times higher than the poorest person. That is immoral, that is wrong, and we are opposed to that, right?
Yep.
But many times, right, inequality that results from markets is simply a reflection of luck, sometimes because of luck, sometimes simply a reflection of individual differences, because you are different from me and I'm different from you, we'll end up in very, very different outcomes, right? So if we treat differences seriously, if you really believe in the importance of diversity and individual differences, there will be some kind of inequality that you must endorse, right? Because we're all different. And if you want to make everyone the same, you have to therefore treat everyone very differently. That's the irony of it.
I think there are some questions in the. Actually, why don't you guys just ask it?
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for the answer, but um, I'm actually inclined to agree with you, lah. I believe that inequality based on fair competition is actually just. But then my professor actually showed me a study, right? From NUS FASS. Then it showed that the absolute poverty level in Singapore is actually above 10%. So he asked me like whether, so if we just leave the markets as it is, right? Do you think the self-correcting mechanism will actually eliminate this poverty? Because since
Do
the
you
goal
remember
is
who
to,
was
I'm
this
sorry.
by Irene Ang? Was the
Let me
study by
see.
Irene Ang?
It could be, Donovan, I think it could be.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she's the most prominent, one of the more prominent researchers on inequality and poverty in Singapore, right? I guess we couldn't really
Yeah,
comment
correct.
without like
Yeah.
looking directly at the study. But here's the thing, right? The devil is in the details. When you say that absolute poverty is 2% or 5% or 10%, right? It all depends on what you really define as poverty, and that all depends on the kind of methodological assumptions underlying your how you defined it. So yeah, I guess I really have to look at the study before I can comment directly on it. And this is actually why the Singapore government has been very, very apprehensive about defining an absolute poverty line, because when you define a poverty line, right, you are the kind of built-in assumption is that you are saying that poor people are all the same, when it's not in fact true, right? There are poor people who genuinely are like in that lot in life, right, because of like unfortunate circumstances. Maybe their families have accidents or like huge hospital bills, or maybe more often than not, if you study sociology, poor people are often have mental illnesses. They are unable to assimilate into the broader economy. And then you have the shirkers, which is to say the people who are truly lazy and don't really give a crap. And that's why they are poor. So when you define a poverty line, right, you are essentially saying that, hey, you know what, everyone below that line, they are from the same, they are there because for the same reason. but it's much, much more complex and multifaceted than that.
I guess we are willing to look at the paper. We are happy to change our minds according to the data, right? I guess another something to add here is that there is this a way of tracking, right, whereby we are tracking individual households and tracking their income mobility over time, right? I think I like dynamic measurements, right? Because we want to see if you are poor 10 years ago, are you still poor 10 years later? Right? So that's what we call intergenerational, income or social mobility. And actually in Singapore, when you're measuring in that way, right, the studies are actually very, very limited because it's not easy to track it that way, because you have to track the same households, the same set of households over two period of time, right? And it's just a very massive logistical effort. So I don't think Donovan and I, we have anything to say about that. But I believe if we had the data for that, I think it may tell us something very different. Because Donovan, if you remember Steve Horwitz, right? He has a study on income mobility in the US over 10, 15 years. And when you track individual American households, right, even though the Gini coefficient has increased, actually the income of specific households, if you track it as a sample, it actually increases, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, I would go with income mobility rather than static measures. Yeah.
Do we have any questions on like the related to behavioral economics? I think there's probably some questions there.
Hi, Bryan. Bryan?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the discussion just now. So I was actually thinking that I think just now you're mentioning something about income mobility, but I feel like in the sense that also we also need to look at the happiness. I feel like this is a very broad topic, and we also talk about the. Actually, I have this module I study in SMU, which talks about the how 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 social mobility affects happiness, and we can see that actually in the high in a social in the US with high social mobility, we can see that actually some people, there's a group of people who may not be very happy also, like they're afraid of being like displaced, like the rich are afraid of being displaced by the poor and all that.
Yeah.
This is what I feel.
So, well, yeah, I mean, I have no opposition to that. I think happiness is very important. I want to be happy. I think we all want to be happy. I think the question is not about whether happiness is important. I'm not trying to say that money is everything, right? Some people have this idea, oh, you believe in free markets. That means you're all about money, right? Money, money, money. It's not about, no, no, no. I mean, money is, to me, is just a means, right? I want money as a means to achieve my goals, and happiness is definitely a very important end in itself. I guess the question is, under what kind of societies, under what kind of institutional systems are you able to facilitate the pursuit of happiness, right? That's the question. How do we facilitate the pursuit of happiness? And I believe that the pursuit of happiness is best achieved in a market framework, right? Why? Because you are able to pursue what means a lot to you, right? If being a dancer, if being a business person means a lot to you, you have the freedom to pursue that and make something out of it in your life, right? I believe that's a pursuit of happiness, right? Which is, by
Yeah.
the way, defined in the American Declaration of Independence, which is a free market system.
There's this whole it's a good question. There's this whole discipline of studies in economics called the happiness studies. I think that's what I think was it Ace was asking the question. I think that's what Ace was referring to, right?
I'm referring
And
to the paper by Alicinia et al. 2004.
okay. I do try to read a lot, but I haven't heard of that paper before. But I think one of the very leading thinkers in this area of happiness studies is this guy called Richard Layard. So essentially what Layard is, he's actually studying, and his conclusion comes up to something similar to what you were saying. Well, maybe what I would say is that just be very careful about how they define happiness, because this guy Richard Layard, when I read a little bit on him, he actually claims that people in the pre-World War II era are happier than people today. Now, that is, to me, is a completely preposterous notion, right? How could it be that people 50 years ago were happier than today? So I think it always comes down again to what are the underlying methodological assumptions. How are you defining happiness? right? And for me personally, I would argue that inequality, happiness, all these statistical measures are important, but what is most important is the system that uplifts people in an absolute material sense. Okay? And by that I mean, even if I may be a poor person in Singapore, I am so much better off than a poor person in another country. I have access to first world education, high quality healthcare, and I'm able to buy technological gadgets that a poor person in a poor country will not have access to. And that is what I think matters. Is what Deirdre McCloskey calls increasing your scope of pot pleasure happiness, right? Is your scope in life large enough for you to pursue these different hobbies? And I think Amartya Sen, who is also a Nobel Prize winner, he also has innovated a new kind of measurement, right? And Amartya Sen is not a free market guy. He's a very left-leaning guy. And what he's saying is that poverty is not all there is to it. We should also look at how we can, poor people in countries do they have a large enough scope to pursue their personal projects in life, and expanding that scope is what I think matters, right? Allowing that person to be able to do as many things as he wants in his life is what matters.
Yeah. Do we have any questions on behavioral economics, on the use of big data to, make policies? Yeah.
Bryan, actually, there are a couple of questions in the chat box. So I would like to. There's definitely one question I just saw on behavioral economics, but I want to go order wise, because there were people who asked questions before as well.
You can select.
So Ariman was the first person who asked a question in the chat, and he asked whether would you say that inequality is driving growth in a capitalistic system, or is it a negative consequence of the system? Is what he asks.
Is inequality driving growth in a capitalist system, or is it a negative consequence of the system? I wouldn't claim that inequality drives growth, right? I don't think, inequality is the engine that leads to growth, and therefore we want to grow. We need more inequality. I don't think that's what I'm claiming, and I don't think any market-leaning economists claim that. I think what drives growth is actually the pursuit of wealth, right? The pursuit of profits, the pursuit of a better life, right? Coordinated within a market system, and overall, when it's the division of labor, comparative advantage, extension of markets, exchange, that's where wealth is created, right? So wealth is a byproduct, right, of individuals pursuing their wishes, pursuing their plans, right? So I would say, yeah, inequality is a consequence. It's a consequence of the fact that people are different, right? No two persons are alike. It's a consequence of the fact that sometimes I may stumble across a profit opportunity that you don't, right? I'm lucky, I met the right person, I worked in the right company, and then, hey, 5 years later, I'm someone. So there's a lot of luck, I guess, involved as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Ariman, does it answer your question, or do you have a counterpoint? Do you have anything to say? Okay.
Thank you so much. I got it. Thanks.
So Ivan also asked a question, and his question was that could you elaborate on the point about if people are fully rational, it can lead to market failure as well, is what Ivan says. Perhaps Ivan can explain his question better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the question, right?
Can you elaborate?
I think what Ivan is trying. I think I get his question. So this one is a bit of a sidetrack, but essentially, if you study market failure theory, which is in like the way back in like the 20th century, right? There are a lot of these arguments that markets don't operate efficiently because of all kinds of market failures. Lemon markets is one by Eckloff. You also have like problems of market failures such as public goods, goods that are essentially both non-rivalrous and non-excludable, right? So you need to have some kind of governments to provide that, because the market won't provide that, because they cannot internalize the profits and revenue from it. And then you also have like externalities, for example, which is where the whole onus for like Pigovian taxation comes in, right? Um, it's it's very hard to go into this right now, but I guess what I would say is that um, just go and look up market failure theory, and a lot of these market failure theories, they were working within a methodological paradigm where people were fully rational, right? Neoclassical economists such as Milton Friedman was saying that people behave rationally and the market will eventually like uh, tend towards some kind of equilibrium. Whereas market failure theories are saying that, okay, we'll take your assumption that people behave rationally, but there are some kind of structural breakdowns in the market, right? And it doesn't really reach that kind of that point of equilibrium. So that was what I was talking about.
I think maybe we can use a very interesting example, right? So I'd like to give the example of the tragedy of the commons. I think some of you may know, right? So the tragedy of the commons, right, is whereby, in a sense, the market fails, even though everyone is actually rational, right? So let's say, there's a common access resource, there is, fisheries, oceans, or, it's like a resource with a lot of animals or trees commonly owned in public, right? Because no one individual owner is going to go in to the resource and strip as much of it as possible. So in this situation, right, every individual is rational because he or she wants to get a slice of the pie, right? And that when everyone does that, the entire resource becomes depleted, right? So you can say, hey, look, the pursuit of self-interest and rationality in this case leads to a suboptimal outcome, right? And therefore, Adam Smith is wrong, markets fail, right? Well, yes, in a way that's true. But Adam Smith did not say, right, that self-interest is always good. Remember the three P's, right, that Donovan shared, right? So people are always self-interested, right? People are always trying to look out for the best deal, for the best arrangement. But what is the outcomes determined by the institutional structure, right? The reason why the pursuit of self-interest in tragedy of the commons case did not work out is because there was no private property rights. The first key was missing, right? So when people were trying to get the best deal for themselves, you end up depleting the whole resource, right? Which is why when you transfer, ownership of resources from common to private ownership, you tend to increase the incentive to conservation, right? And usually resources become better conserved in that second situation, right? So rationality is one thing, but also the institutions, the environment, right, of the interactions is important as well. That can determine whether the rationality or irrationality will lead to a good or bad outcome. Yeah.
Ivan, did you get your answer? Okay. Okay.
I see another question by on organ transplants by using an opt-out policy. Are there cases of such a policy backfiring where too many people opt out? Um, I wouldn't use the word backfiring. I don't know if the questioner is still around or not, but I guess I'm just going to answer it. I wouldn't use the word as backfiring because you see, right, the whole idea of behavioral economics is that they want to incentivize better behavior, more optimal outcomes, but they still want to give people the voluntary choice to the choice to make these decisions. So I mean, if people do backfire, I mean, if people do opt out, I don't really see that as essentially a huge problem because my personal political philosophy is that I think that people should be able to make most choices for themselves in their lives anyway. So if like I have like some if the person has like some irrational belief, maybe he thinks that in 200 years time they're going to invent like devices that will resurrect people, and he say, oh no, I don't want to opt out of my organ transplant because I might be able to come back to life. Then I think that's their prerogative. And I would say that the policymaker already has done his best to try and incentivize those choices. But if people still choose to opt out, then we should respect those decisions.
Right. I guess the next question is how much is behavioral economics a field that's growing right now, especially in Singapore, both in the private and public sector? I would say it's growing. It's really growing. Okay, as we have experienced, the Singapore government loves behavioral economics because it provides them with theoretical as well as practical avenues, right, to shape people's behavior, to shape Singaporeans' choices, right. We talked about public, we didn't really mention private sector. I was in a conference once last year, right? And this guy said, "Oh, you're an economist. Can I, hire you as a consultant and you share with me behavioral economics so I can psycho my customers, so I can psycho them to buy more things from me." Right. So yes, I think behavioral economics is quite big because I think there are private companies that believe that with this framework, they can, manipulate customers. They can
Yeah.
manipulate people in order to buy more things.
I,
Create.
I should I should add something, right? Actually, it's a very good question by Macarius. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but it's a very good question actually because personally, I'm not opposed to behavioral economics applications in the private sector, and in fact, it is pervasive, right? Advertising companies, they a lot of their advertisements are driven by psychological insights. What colors they think will induce better pickup rates, or like marketing, the way they design like the packaging of foods and etc. So behavioral economics has a lot of potential, has a lot of use, but I think where free market economists and intellectuals object to is the monopolization of this by the government, right? Saying that the government is the only one who can say that we want to nudge people a certain way because it's presumably good for some kind of public policy outcome. Whereas what we would prefer is a plurality of competition. Even when there's nudging, right? There's also there should be competition to nudging, right? Like when I walk past a shopping mall and I see a huge advertisement of a gym advertisement, that in some sense is a form of nudging. It's nudging me to stop being so lazy and going the workout, right? So or like for example, if you pick up like foods and then they have like healthier food labels, that's also another form of nudging that's very pervasive in the private sector. But how exactly that kind of nudging should be carried out, that should be subject to competition as well. And it goes back to what Bryan and I were talking about when we were talking about the 3Ps equals to 3Is slide, and why we need market competition, because precisely because we don't know how exactly the best outcomes can be reached, and that's why we need that market competition.
Right. I guess Donovan, we are able to answer the next one. Is using
Mm,
big data for central planning a bad idea?
yeah, maybe you can go back one slide.
Yeah, I know which one you mean.
Yeah. Okay, so this one is a little bit philosophical, right? But I'll try my best to answer it in a summary way. The short answer is no, we do not think that that is possible. And because big data it essentially conflates data and knowledge, right? So I wrote here, right? Data what data is, it tells us something about the past. It tells us that a certain product was bought in a certain quantity at a certain time in the past, right? But it is silent on the context by which it happened. And therefore it's an incomplete representation. And that's why when you have a data set and you try to analyze it, whether you are a civil servant or you are a private sector analyst, right? You do need to have some kind of assumptions. You do need to sort of assume, okay, I think this happened this way because there was like, I don't know, the Trump China trade war, right? Whereas when you want to plan the economy, data doesn't really tell you, data only tells you what happened in the past. Whereas what you need is the data in the future, which is what we are calling knowledge, right? Knowledge exists within a unique context of time and place. It is our personal thoughts, beliefs, values, and preferences. And it's precisely again, we go back to the 3Ps and the 3Is. What kind of institutional structure, what kind of institutional market best harnesses on the knowledge that exists in the minds of people? And I would argue that it is a competitive market process that best harnesses on that kind of knowledge, right? It is when firms are competing and consumers are being tucked to and fro from the best discounts and best offers. When that process of competition is taking place, that's when we know exactly how is it that how much we should need for a certain resource, and how much firms should fall if they need to. So going back to big data planning, I think essentially a lot of policymakers think that because they have huge data sets, right, they are able to plan the economy in a way that is that will mitigate for like certain future macroeconomic fallouts, right? And that I think is just it's just an experiment setting up to fail. You can try to approximate for it, but planning it is a whole different ball game. Yeah.
I guess, Donovan and I, we come from a school of thought that emphasizes, right, the severity of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty, right, is not just a lack of information waiting to be filled up by surveys. We just plug the information in, right? Is what we call unknown unknowns. Sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. Right? So the economy, and especially the future of the economy, is so complex, right? And so fundamentally difficult to ascertain that it's just really, really difficult to piece it all together, right? To piece it all together. And to just give you, a personal example, I was in the government before, right? So I know how, the government does some policy review. So let's just give an example, right? There was a policy that, I was tasked to review with my colleagues. How do we do it? Firstly, we look at statistics, look at past results, whether companies have gone on the ground, what's the effectiveness, what's the percentage change of some indicators, right? Okay, and then you can use qualitative things, right? You can survey, you can talk to people and all that, right? But how much can these tools, right, really find out, right, about the nature of knowledge, which Donovan explains a very tacit thing that sometimes I don't even know what I like or what I want until I go to the store, and buy something, right? In fact, economists emphasize that knowledge is tacit knowledge. So think of tacit knowledge as riding a bicycle, right? For example, if you want me to articulate to you how I'm riding my bicycle, I can't, right? What is the 5 steps process of riding a bicycle? I cannot, right? Riding a bicycle is something that I somehow acquired through the process of riding a bicycle, right? And because it's tacit, there's no way for me to capture it or articulate it. So there's a lot of knowledge that cannot be rendered into statistical format, that cannot be rendered in a quantitative format, and therefore it cannot be aggregated, right, by supercomputers, by AI, by I know recently there is this idea of supercomputers, right? Supercomputers can somehow plan the economy in a way that we've never had before. So, we don't need markets anymore, but I'm very skeptical.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot more to these questions, and of course, it's very hard to answer them within a few minutes. Maybe what you can do is to sort of like do like set up a Facebook post on our Facebook, and then you guys can just put the questions there, and then we'll try to answer it to the best of our abilities.
Yeah. Any other questions? I'm happy to stay as long as anyone wishes.
I think Ariman asks one more question. I'm just reading the chat. So he asks what the difference between behavioral science and behavioral economics in that sense, right? He says that is it behavioral science that the private sector is pursuing or behavioral economics? So
I
could you
think it's the
elaborate
same
on
thing,
that?
right? The behavioral sciences and behavioral economics is the same thing, right? I'm not sure what the distinction is.
Okay.
I guess from I think behavioral economics, I would think is a subset of behavioral science. There are a lot of people studying behavioral sciences without necessarily, applying economic analysis, I suppose.
Yep.
So you can be a behavioral scientist, maybe you're a psychologist, you are a biologist, you study human behavior, right? But you may not be applying economic analysis or applying behavioral lens to economic questions. It's possible. Yeah. So I think private sector, I guess they are using different things. They're using behavioral science and economics because they are an economic agent. They are part of the economy, right? So I think it's both. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see more questions here. Bernie,
So,
right?
yeah, Bernie asks a question. Do you want to read it out or should I read it out and then you want to answer?
Economics shifts the scope of economics from predicting the future into attempts to manipulate the future, right? And big data brings forth the precision in which we can manipulate the short-term future. I guess that's accurate, I think. Donovan, you think that's accurate?
Big data brings forth the precision in which we can manipulate the short-term future. I think most economists, this is not something that's exclusive to behavioral econs, right? Most economists at least in the mainstream schools, and especially in macroecons, they are trying to make some kind of a prediction on how the economy would develop, right? But maybe why you think that this manipulation element is stronger in behavioral econs is because now when it's a very micro, we are looking at like how individual people are biased and flawed, and then now we are trying to alter their behavior. So yeah, it's some kind of manipulation, sure, but I would say that most of econs essentially is in that ball game, right? They are trying to influence, like, or if you look at like market failures, they're trying to prevent the markets from failing so that like to induce certain kinds of um, consumer outcomes as well. So I don't think it's that different. Maybe except for like the Austrian School of Economics, where Bryan and I are more leaning towards. There's one school of economics that essentially says that the role of econs is not to try and predict the future, but more importantly, the role of the economist is to try and understand the kinds of rules of the game and institutions that can facilitate that coordination of different plans in the economy, right?
To supplement what Donovan has shared, right? Economics, right, is actually a very rich field of study. Economics, if done right, it can actually incorporate different methodological toolkits, right? So mainstream economics is very wedded to the use of quantitative tools, econometrics, and statistical analysis in order to predict, in order to make analysis of broad patterns of behavior. That's fine and that's great. There is a place for that, right? But however, when it comes to economics, right, and understanding human behavior, there's a lot to it that cannot just be understood in a quantitative sense, right? So there is a very famous phrase that said the facts of the social sciences are what people think and believe, right? So if you think about economic behavior, right, why do you buy certain things? Why do you join certain companies, right? Why do you make certain contracts? Right? We can't fully understand a lot of economic behavior without understanding what people think and what people believe. And if you want to understand what people think and what people believe, right, you may have to use qualitative methods. You may have to do ethnography. You may have to do interviews, right? So economics, right, should be a very interdisciplinary, a very broad field, which incorporates different kind of methodologies. Yeah.
So thank you for that. So thank you so much for coming. I think all of us really enjoyed this talk, and thank you so much, Donovan, as well. I think it was really interesting.
Sure,
And
happy to be here. Thanks for taking the time.
Right? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.